Every time I shoot this video, it's getting harder and harder. So here's what I'm going to do. I'm going to try and do this in one take as best as I can. So I'm going to share my thoughts really quickly on Howl's Moving Castle, the book versus the movie. And I'm going to go ahead and be honest right here, right now. And if this makes you click away, I'm sorry. I really like the movie much better than the book. Maybe if I read the book more than once, I might have different feelings on it because I've seen the movie plenty of times. But for right now, I feel like the movie is just a much better, more enjoyable viewing experience. It's just better to me. The book seems to have some really cool ideas and some great plot lines, but to me, it almost gets a little too convoluted at the end. And while I do believe that the movie has a bit of a rushed ending, it's just simpler in nature. And sometimes, if your story's getting too convoluted, it's better to go simpler, at least in my personal opinion. But for those who don't know anything about Howl's Moving Castle, it's basically about a girl named Sophie. And she gets cursed by this woman called the Witch of the Waste, and this curse turns her old. So, as an old woman, she goes and seeks out this wizard named Howl, and he has this castle that's moving around, which is why it's called Howl's Moving Castle. At this castle, she pretends to be a cleaning lady, and she kind of strikes up a deal with Howl's fire demon called Calcifer. Calcifer claims that him and Howl have this curse on them that they can't talk about, and meanwhile Sophie has a curse on her that she can't talk about. And Calcifer says, hey, you help me get rid of my curse, I help you get rid of your curse. Simple as that. And throughout this story, this is a romance. And it is about Howl and Sophie falling in love. Alright? Or their attempt to fall in love. We'll say that so it maybe doesn't spoil anything. I feel like that's about as much as I can say without spoiling it. So if you've never experienced either of these, go ahead. The movie's less than 2 hours long. The book is, I think, less than 400 pages, I would say, or around 400. So neither one is like the most massive time commitment. If you want to experience a fantasy romance story, this is a pretty good one overall. But here is what I'm going to talk about today. And just to be clear, no insult towards the original author when I'm doing my comparisons, because this is some pretty good storytelling as far as I can tell. And she's very creative. Obviously, she was very creative. And without her, you would not have the movie. So everything I say, take it with a grain of salt. So the beginning, there's not a lot of differences. Sophie is working in a hat shop for her stepmother. In the book, you find out that Sophie has two sisters, and the reason why Sophie's in the hat shop is the other two sisters have been sent to go work. One goes to the bakery, and the other one ends up going to work with a sorceress. Sophie, being the eldest, is put in charge of the hat shop. And one day she goes to visit one of her sisters and finds out the two sisters have traded places using a magic spell, so no one will know the difference between the two of them. And in this conversation, Sophie finds out that her mom doesn't really like the three girls that much. She's kind of a bit of a manipulator. All she's doing really is making Sophie do all the work while she gallivants around and gets to live, the ritzy life. And obviously that bothers Sophie. And all of that happens in the book before she ends up, going to get turned into an old woman and all that. She has a very brief encounter with Howl that isn't really that big of a deal. It's not really presented as a big deal. She, goes to the house after getting cursed, the moving castle, and has a conversation with Calcifer and all that stuff. The movie kind of simplifies this. There's only one sister. The mom's manipulative tendencies are not really on display as much. You can kind of tell she's maybe a little bit frivolous, but not necessarily a bad person or anything like that. Then, when she's on her way to go talk with her sister in the movie version, these two guys try hitting on her, and it freaks her out. And Howl actually shows up, and the two of them go on this little walk together where they end up flying temporarily, literally walking on the air, while Howl is trying to escape from the Witch of the Waste's minions. And then after that, after she goes back home and gets cursed, a lot of the events are kind of the same thing. She helps this, in both versions, she helps this scarecrow that's been cursed, and she calls him Turnip Head, which I'll go ahead and say, if you've watched the movie and you adore Turnip Head, in the book, he's not there as much, and he's a bit more antagonistic, because every time he tries to get close to Sophie after she initially helps him, she panics. And I'll explain that hopefully very well at the end, or near the end. Now, in the castle itself, there's a very big difference. There's this young fella. In the book, he's called Michael. In the movie, it's like Markle or something along those lines. In the book, he's only a few years younger than Sophie, like 16 to 18, somewhere in there. In the movie, he's like 10. So that automatically changes the dynamic a lot more, because in this romance, it's very clear that in the book, it's going to be like a younger brother situation. In the movie, it's very clearly going to be a more of a son kind of scenario, because Hal clearly is fulfilling almost like a father role to this young orphan boy. So that's a big difference. Another difference between them that I was kind of amused by, and before I say this, something I find interesting about adaptations is, I feel like, and if anyone has ever said this before, I'm sorry for ripping them off, but to me, a good adaptation needs something, and it needs to follow a recipe. Yes, you can make some level of substitutions with that recipe, but at the end of the day, if you say, I'm going to make a pumpkin pie, it needs to look, taste, and smell like a pumpkin pie. It needs to have the feel of a pumpkin pie. If you turn up to a party saying, I brought pumpkin pie, and it turned out you made sweet potato, yes, the people who like sweet potato pie and did not want pumpkin, or didn't care if they got pumpkin, are going to like it. But the ones who wanted pumpkin pie are going to be massively disappointed. That, to me, is what a good adaptation should be. It should be, you went to go make pumpkin pie, you followed the directions, you changed a couple of things because you had to, or you needed to, but you still have a pumpkin pie at the end of the day. A bad adaptation is sweet potato pie, because it's not what you set out to make. But I would say halfway through, almost, they're pretty close. It's that kind of very close adaptation in terms of, source material to the adapted form. But it does change as the story goes on. So let me talk about an amusing change. There's this big scene that's set up. Hal likes to put a lot of attention into his looks. He spends a lot of time in the bathroom, hours on end, making himself look nice. And he tells Sophie, please do not go into my bathroom. Don't change anything. But Sophie's being a good cleaning woman, so bathroom's dirty, and she's going to do what she wants to do. So she goes in there to clean the bathroom. After she does that, Hal goes back in. And obviously, his potions are not where he wants them. And it has a somewhat hilarious result. In the movie, he comes out with his hair, which is usually blonde, coming out red. And he panics, saying he looks hideous. And he even flops in a chair and says, I give up, I shouldn't live if I can't be beautiful. Something along those lines. This scene purely shows that Hal really cares about his looks, and he's kind of petty. It's just a bad hair look that he didn't like. It's not that big of a deal. This is a much more toned down version as the book. Because in the book, he comes out, his hair looks identical with the exception of one strand that is different, a different color. I would say probably red. And that alone shows you how much more petty he is in the book. Because I'll go ahead and say, the author, there's a little afterword where they have a little interview with the author, and she's asked about the movie. And she seems to somewhat be okay with the movie. She doesn't seem to actively hate it like some people do. But she did say that the characters in the movie are much more noble than the characters she made in the book. And that's fair enough to say. Because I don't know if Hal would have gotten that mad over one hair being the wrong color, but I'll talk more about the nobility in a minute. But it's very clear with both instances that he's petty and he cares about his looks, but the book shows it a lot more and makes him way more childish. Now, I know someone would say, well, why didn't they just do that in the movie? Clearly the book is doing a good job. Why did they change it? Well, think about it. It's animation, and animation costs money, and you want the audience to be able to understand as much information in as short time as possible. That's what you're going to do with a movie. Which is going to be easier to animate and help the audience understand, like I said earlier, his pettiness and how much how vain he is. And it would definitely be coloring all of his hair orange or, red, and then having him freak out about it. Meanwhile, in the book form, if they try to just discolor one hair, maybe they would notice it, maybe they wouldn't. So that could be a bit of a problem. And then you'd have to waste extra time, animating one hair being a different color. But continuing on with the nobility of these characters, in the movie, all right, I was thinking about the book when I was pointing at the movie. In the movie, it is very clear that Sophie is a very decent young lady, and Hal is a bit of kind of a footloose and fancy-free kind of guy who hates responsibility completely. And throughout the movie, Sophie falls in love with him because she learns that he's not as bad as some people say he is, because people say Hal is an evil wizard and he goes around eating women's hearts. He steals their hearts. But once she gets to know him, she realizes he's not a bad guy at all. He's very kind. He's very nice. He's just a bit of a coward, and he doesn't like responsibility. And around the same time, Hal starts to take a really deep interest in Sophie, despite the fact that she looks like a 90-year-old woman. He falls in love with her, and he cares a lot about her and wants to protect her, which is kind of a, pretty big deal, obviously. But in terms of who Sophie is, she doesn't have to change too much, I would say. She does have a character arc, but it's not like she's a bad person. It's more about her learning to love somebody. Meanwhile, in the book, Hal and Sophie are much more antagonistic towards each other. They fight like cats and dogs. When Sophie does something, Hal loses his temper, and Hal does things that make Sophie lose her temper. So automatically, their relationship is a lot more volatile. And I will go ahead and say the romance does take a little while to get there. I feel like it really doesn't start entering in until the final third. And you don't really know that Hal loves her, in my opinion, until probably the last quarter. So it's kind of dropped on you near the end. And unfortunately, near the end of the story, there's kind of some major plot revelations that are going on. So you don't really, to me personally, I'm not that interested in the romance. Meanwhile, in the movie, the fact that the romance has already been established pretty much by the halfway point, at least from Sophie's perspective, kind of makes the ending have a little bit more investment, because they're not realizing they love each other. It's like, oh, they do care about each other. Okay. So whenever, bombs are going off, you're like, oh no, I hope they're all okay. But There's a few other differences. Like, for instance, the book has extra characters. Like, for instance, while Turnip Head is not a very important character, the scarecrow that has a curse on him, there's this dog character that in the movie is just a dog, but actually in the book he has a lot more to do with this plot, because he's actually a man who has been turned into a dog. And he can't remember too much of what's going on, but I'll tell more about what he is in a minute. And also, in the movie, the prince has gone missing. There's a prince, and this missing prince has basically been the crux of this battle going on with a couple of nations, okay? Which, conveniently, Howl has been enlisted, I think, in the military of the native country that they're living in, but not the other one, to the best of my knowledge. But in the book, there's two people missing. There's the prince, and then there's this wizard named Solomon. Now, if you've watched the movie, you know Solomon's kind of an important character in the movie. She's this old woman in the movie who's trained Howl, and she's kind of creepy because, number one, she's the right hand of the king, and she's clearly using her powers to keep this war going, to help out with this war. But she doesn't really seem to care if the war is won or not. But one thing you do know she cares about is Howl, because she has a bunch of these young servant boys who are waiting on her hand and foot, and they all look like Howl does at the beginning. They're all blonde-haired boys with, I think, blue eyes, and they don't delve into that. That's just a little nugget of information that's dropped there and then left there, and it's very creepy. And then once the movie reaches its end and Howl has fallen in love with Sophie, and everything, basically Solomon is like, okay, let's tell the king the war is over. So you realize, was this whole war just her big attempt at trying to win Howl over? And the answer is probably yeah. But in the book, the teacher for Howl is a completely different character. And she's not named Solomon. I can't even remember her name off the top of my head, but she's clearly this very nice woman who cares a lot about Howl, and she ends up dying, so she's not in the story that much. The king, who is this warmonger in the book, in the movie, not the book. In the book, though, he's kind of a nice guy. He's not that bad. But the character of Solomon is a completely different guy. Because there's this bit of I guess you could say a plot twist or revelation about Howl part of the way through the book, which is in the moving castle, there's this door, and there's 4 different knobs. Well, 4 different ways you can turn the knob. And there's this certain way you turn the knob where there's this little black dot. If you turn it towards the black dot, it leads to this dark portal. And in the movie version, the dark portal seems to lead back to Howl's past. But in the book, it literally leads to his home country, which I believe is Wales. Basically, he's from the human world. And not just him, Solomon as well. They're both from the human world, and they've come to Sophie's world, which is this kind of fantasy realm. Obviously, that is an element that's nowhere in the movie, and obviously since Solomon is a really evil woman in the movie, this element is nowhere there as well. But in the book, Solomon went to go find the prince, and he's been missing too. And this is where I'll go into the major spoilers at the end. So if you feel like I haven't spoiled it too much and you want to go experience both of these, go ahead. But as the story reaches its conclusion, a major revelation happens. So, the Witch of the Waste is a lady who's been trying to win Howl over. Supposedly, they used to date at one point, and Howl left her, and she's been ticked off about it ever since. And in the movie, she kind of stops being a threat around the same time that Sophie and Howl meet Solomon, the evil woman, because her powers are basically taken away from her, and she kind of is this doting, senile, acting old woman who, just really wants Hal to love her, and obviously she doesn't get the love she wants in the end. But in the book, she is an evil woman who made a deal with a demon just like Hal, but her demon is a lot more vicious than Calcifer. Calcifer just is content to complain and try and strike deals with people and move around a castle. Meanwhile, the Witch of the Wastes fire demon is basically the final boss of the book, because Hal ends up having this confrontation with the Witch of the Waste and she's defeated, and Sophie kind of goes on her own little quest, and it causes her to have to confront the Witch of the Waste's demon. And the demon has clearly been trying to cause problems in various means, because she basically disguised herself as a woman in the home country of Wales and tried to snuggle up close to Hal through those means. And just to give some clarity to her evilness, let me go ahead and clear things up. This demon and the Witch of the Waste succeeded in killing both the prince and Solomon. And their bodies are basically mashed together in this horrific, almost Frankenstein's creature kind of thing, I think, if I remember correctly. Meanwhile, their heads are missing. The heads have been converted into the Dogman creature and Turnip Head. And obviously, there's a great final battle where Turnip Head shows up and Hal, and they're fighting the fire demon. And, obviously, all's well that ends well. Seems like all the main characters are, they have somebody, that they can get married to. Sophie's curse kind of goes away, which I assume it's because the Witch of the Waste is completely defeated. Meanwhile, in the movie, it seems almost like that true love ended up breaking the spell. But in the book, it's definitely, I would say, connected to the defeat of the Witch of the Waste and her fire demon. But I will say, I wish that climax could have been included somehow in the movie. It wouldn't have fit in as well, but I feel like that would have been interesting. I don't know how you would have pulled it off. I don't know how Miyazaki would have made that work, but I would have liked it. Because I feel like that was probably one of the few instances where I feel like the book really was better. Because, again, as I said, I like the movie better because of the simplicity. There's almost too much going on in the book, and maybe it was because I wasn't completely focused. But I feel like the book had so many plot threads going on, and when they finally started to tie together, some of them felt like, okay, this makes sense, but then other times I felt like, I'm not a big fan of that. It's a little too much all at once. Because the book literally has it while Sophie is going to go battle the fire demon of the Witch of the Waste, her family's all chilling at the castle now. All her family's at the castle, which I'm like, I kind of liked her and Hal being by themselves with Marco and Calcifer and the Witch of the Waste, and and them having their own kind of little family like they do in the movie. But again, it really is, what it depends on your point of view and what you prefer. To me, I like the simplicity better, as opposed to, too many plot threads that kind of get confusing, to me at least, near the end, where it's almost a little too much. Also, I do prefer how these characters in the movie are a bit nicer, as opposed to sometimes in the book I think it'd be safe to say that some people would get kind of turned off by their attitudes at some point. But, it is what it is. Either way, I do have the sequel books. I have the other two Howl's Moving Castle series books. I'm going to get around to reading those eventually, but I really needed a break. Um, Obviously, you can buy the books off Amazon, or you can go find them probably at a local bookstore. The movie, obviously, Amazon, or anywhere where you can go buy anime. Um, Either way, I'm glad I experienced both of these. Obviously, the movie will be something I experienced much more than the book, but maybe, who knows? One day I might get around to reading that book again. It's not high on my priority, but we'll have to see. Either way, I'm not going to say, with the book, I will not say I hate it, because this is in that I'm glad it exists. There's a lot of ways to consider um, the value of a story, and I feel like it's so much more complicated than just I liked it or I hated it. We don't have to always go to it doesn't have to be the extreme of best ever or worst ever. And I really don't like that in terms of criticism. For me, it was okay. It was fine. It wasn't the best, it wasn't the worst. It was okay, and I'm glad it's out there in the world. Meanwhile, the movie, I consider that probably a really decent movie that I would recommend to almost anybody. But either way, thank you so much for staying this long and listening to me ramble. I'm glad I finally got it on a take that actually works. You have a good day, and God bless.